Hi guys, welcome back to my channel and to today's video where I'm going to be drawing a realistic cheetah eye for you guys and giving you some tips on how you can create that glassy looking eye and also creating some of the fur around it as well. So if that's something that you're looking to improve, then make sure you carry on watching. Before we get into that though, I do just want to mention that this is available as a real-time tutorial over on my Patreon page and also to my Club Puffin website subscription. You can subscribe up to either of those on the $14 tier on Patreon and the Club Puffin one on my website, and you'll get access to this. It's a full-time tutorial. This was actually a live draw along session that I've turned into a full tutorial, so if you want to subscribe over there and have some real live draw along sessions where you can ask me questions and all that kind of stuff, then that's gonna be available on those two platforms for you. And there's also a whole host of other real-time tutorials over on my Patreon and my website as well, which will keep you busy for a very long time. There's a lot on there at the moment. Anyway, let's get into this cheetah eye study. So, first thing that I've done is actually worked on the eye itself, and what I've done is made sure that I've outlined the iris, so the coloured part of the eye, with a dark pencil. So I've used a dark sepia in this case. I've also gone into the pupil and outlined that as well, and made sure that I used a light pressure at first to make sure that I get the shape of the eye and the pupil right, and then I've gone in with a harder pressure to make sure that I kind of define those lines and get that really nice crisp outer edge. I've then worked into the areas of highlight, which are just on the pupil, with a white pencil. I've used a Holbein soft white pencil because I find that one's really nice and opaque, and it works really nicely as a initial colour to put down because it's really waxy, and then your other pencils don't tend to stick to it too much. It's also good that it can go over your darker colours as it's nice and opaque as well. So if you do happen to put down a darker colour, you can use the Holbein soft white to go over the top, and it's going to come out really nice and white and opaque. Next, all I've done is just layered up my yellow colours onto the iris. I've used a small circular motion to help really get into the tooth of the paper and to convey that kind of circular, kind of spherical shape of the actual iris and the eyeball and everything. So I'm making sure I'm using circular motions and just working around the eye, and I'm working from my lightest colours, which happen to be ivory and some light yellow, and then working into the darker colours, and I'm mainly putting the darker colours around the edges of the eye. So at the top, where you can see you've got a really dark band going over the top underneath the top eyelid, and then around the bottom as well. Adding the dark colours around the edges like this just really help to give that spherical shape. Keeping the middle really light, it just helps it look really spherical, makes it look like it's a round object sitting within an eye socket and that kind of thing. So you just want to make sure that you keep your edges nice and dark, as you would often find darker edges where you've got kind of stuff overlapping as well. So you've got these eyelids and everything coming around, so it's going to be a lot darker around there. So just make sure that you keep those edges nice and dark, the middle of the eye quite light. And I've also added in a little bit of shading around the pupil. So some colours that I've added in here are actually some greens to help really accent the yellows, and I've also added in some dark indigo because mixed with the yellows that I've chosen for this particular one, it creates a really nice green tone, and it just sits really nice. It's kind of a harmonious colour palette, so you've got that yellow, green, and then you've got some blue going on as well. I've used some colours like burnt sienna, some walnut brown. I've also used a little bit of light flesh, or beige red as it's now called in the polychromos, around the edges as well. And I've also used the lighter colours like the ivory and, as I mentioned, that light flesh or the beige red to go in and blend the eye as well. As you can see, the texture of the eye kind of looks a little bit not bumpy, but it kind of looks like not really smooth. And if you really look closely at eyes, some of them don't necessarily look entirely 100% smooth. They do have like these little darker patches, and they do kind of look a little bit grainy. And I've just achieved that by layering some of the darker colours, as I mentioned, the dark indigo, some walnut brown, just kind of lightly glaze those over the top, just to give that hint of kind of paper texture showing through. It works really nicely for eyes like this, where you do have a little bit more texture coming through into the actual iris itself. I've covered eyes in depth on my channel a lot before, so if you want to know any kind of more techniques on how to get a glassy looking eye, you can check out the other eye drawings that I've got. But basically, in essence, what you want to do is just make sure you use a circular motion and work from light to dark, and then use your lighter colours to blend and everything over the top, even using a little bit of white to blend over the top. It's going to help create that nice glassy spherical shape and look of the eye. So moving on to the fur and the outer eyelids. I've already just completed the outer eyelids, but basically all I did there was the same as what I did for the initial blocking in of the eye. So using that darker pencil, just going in and adding in some of the darker areas in that tear duct area and around the lower eyelid and everything, just making sure that I use a light pressure at first, going in and blocking that out, and then when I'm happy I can go in with a harder pressure and a few more other colours. So again, using some blue, some walnut brown, mixing those two together to get a really nice dark colour, adding in some more dark sepia, and then using the lighter colours to kind of blend over the top and create that waterline along the lower eyelid there. I'm also using that Holbein soft white to come in there and really add some opaque white colour over the top as well. So this particular cheetah eye study, the cheetah had some wiry looking fur over the eye, the top eyelid there, and also off into the eyebrow area. If you look closely at a cheetah's fur, it does tend to be quite kind of wiry looking, kind of bristly looking. So in order to achieve that kind of texture, what I've done before I've added in any kind of base layer for the fur or anything, I've used an embossing tool. I'm going to leave a link in the description for these because these are always something that you guys ask about. And all I've done is just indented the paper. You don't have to use an embossing tool. You can use a sharp white pencil. You can use the edge of a pen, like an empty pen barrel. I'm going to leave a video explaining how you can use an embossing tool and everything in the description below as well for you guys. Basically all I've done is taken one of those tools, I've indented the paper, I've overlapped these lines so it kind of looks like they're nice and wiry and everything, and then when you add pencil over the top, as you can see what I've done here, you kind of get this groove in the paper where you don't have any pencil deposited, and that helps you create a really nice wiry look. You can see that the texture above the eye looks kind of scraggly, it kind of looks a little bit more like when you touch it, it would be like kind of like a beard hair, that kind of thing. And then the fur around the outer edge and underneath is a little bit softer. So for that type of fur, all we're doing is just layering down nice and lightly with our base tone, which in this case happens to be a warm grey one. I'm also pairing it with a little bit of ivory where I've got some warmer tones as well. And then just layering up to the darker colours. For the initial layers of the fur, I am using a shading motion and I'm working in the direction of the fur. So I'm working back and forth really lightly with my pencil, kind of holding it almost parallel to the table. And then just working it back and forth in the direction of the fur. And then as I'm getting towards the darker colours, as you can see what I'm doing now with some burnt ochre, I'm adding in some fur lines along with some shading. So I'm adding in some shading first, then going over with a few fur lines to start to add in that definition, and then if needed to hype up the saturation or get a nice darker colour and really build that texture, I'm going in and glazing or shading a little bit more over the top to really add to the depth of the fur. And then I'm building up into my very darkest colours, so using some walnut brown and burnt sienna, that kind of thing, and again just using the side of the pencil to do some shading if I've got some areas of some deeper saturation of colour, and I'm using the pencil to add in some fur lines as well to get that definition in there. I am going through and blending a little bit with the lighter pencils, especially in the underside of the eye where the fur is a little bit softer, but I'm not going in and blending like really heavily. I'm using that same light pressure throughout the entire process of this. So I'm just repeating those steps of working lightest to my darkest colours and adding in the shading with those lighter colours, and then slowly building in the fur lines with the darker colours. As you build up to the darker colours, you want to make sure that your fur lines get less and less. So with your mid-tones is where you're going to be adding in some fur lines. You want to add more of those, and then as you're building up to like a walnut brown or a dark sepia or something like that, you want to add fewer fur lines and you want to space them further apart, and you want to do that, otherwise you're going to end up with a really solid concentration of a brown colour or a darker colour, and it's going to kind of muddy your fur rather than just having like these little highlights and hints of these darker fur lines poking through. You're just going to end up with a dark area. If you want to end up with a dark area, then that's completely fine, like if you've got a really dark patch of fur. But if you've got some lighter patches of fur that are just kind of interspersed with these darker fur lines, like you can see that I'm adding in the eyebrow area here, then you don't want to add them close together, otherwise you are just going to get a whole big clump mass of them, and it's not going to have any of those lighter fur lines showing through or anything like that. As you can see, I'm just kind of adding in some more embossed lines on this part of the cheetah and really overlapping and making them work in different directions. That's key for this type of fur, to make it look kind of wiry. You want to make sure that you work in a few different directions, you really overlap them as well and make them as squiggly as possible. And then when you're going in and adding in your pencil over the top, you want to make sure that you shade with your base layers, and then when you're coming in with your darker colours, instead of just following the direction of the fur, you want to make sure that you follow the same pattern as what you've done with the embossing lines. So adding in some pieces of fur, some shadows within the fur that are going in completely different directions, and that's just going to really help convey this dark, dense, kind of squiggly nature. Like you can really sink your fingers into it and it's going like right down in there, if you get what I mean. That's going to help to convey that kind of texture just by working in some slightly different directions and not just working in the direction of the fur all the time. And that's pretty much all I've got for you for this short tutorial. As I said, if you want to follow along in real time with a lot more in-depth instruction and a real kind of deconstruction of how I go about doing this, then make sure you pop on over to my Patreon and to my Club Puffin website, whichever one you decide. They're exactly the same. It's up to you which platform you decide to subscribe to. But follow on over there and you'll find all of the tutorials that I have on offer. And if you want to sample a real-time tutorial, then use the link in the description below. That's going to get you access to a real-time 2.5-hour tiger eye tutorial, and you can try out my tutorials for free before you decide to subscribe, but I'm sure you're going to love it anyway. But yeah, that's all I've got for you today. I hope you've enjoyed this one and learned a few new techniques that you can add to your own colour pencil drawings, and I'll catch you guys in the next tutorial. Bye!